romantic tradition in science fiction literature. He's going to give us a talk today on the present state of science fiction. I believe he's going to discuss such topics as what the new wave is, and he has some position papers and other items which he has here also, which you may want to speak to him about afterwards. Mr. Pierce?
Gentlemen, I feel somewhat out of place here among a speaker's program that I understand includes a number of college professors with academic qualifications in their fields. Also, I should state at the outset that this is the first time I've ever attended one of these libertarian conferences. I know practically nothing about the movement except what I read in the mass media, and I've never really been associated that much with politics since campus politics. However, that doesn't matter a great deal because I'm here to talk about science fiction and the crisis that's facing science fiction right now. Very few people, I find, even people with college degrees, really understand very much about science fiction. The popular idea of the field seems to be these monster movies you get from Japan, or else pseudo-intellectual things like Alphaville, or if you learn in college English courses that science fiction is really, well, just sort of satire like Swift did with gadgets thrown in. I'm afraid these are all ideas you'll have to get cleared out of your minds if you're going to understand anything at all about science fiction. Actually, what science fiction is not so much the gadgetry that everybody associates with it, though this is an essential element. What science fiction is really about is the problems of change and evolution. Now, you've got to understand that we're living in an age which is changing faster than any before in human history. As a matter of fact, it was only in the last 150 years that it finally dawned on humanity that change was the most important factor in human existence. Now, back in the Middle Ages, life hardly changed for anyone in any qualitative sense during a single lifetime. You might have new kings and new wars, but basically it was the same old thing. Medieval writers didn't even have much conception of the past. You had tales about the Roman poet Virgil, which made him into sort of a necromancer, and ancient Rome was seen as a backward projection of medieval feudalism. But with the coming of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, it suddenly dawned on people that the future was going to be different from the past, and that they had to be interested in the future. Now, science fiction began as part of the Romantic school of literature. This was partly just accident. It was dominant in the 19th century, as you know, people like Hugo and Dumas and like that. But there was a significant difference with science fiction. That's whereas the mainstream romanticism was basically an expression of traditional values and therefore rather nostalgic. You had things like the Three Musketeers. Science fiction was rather forward-looking. There wasn't this Minogue-Chivi thing. Writers like Jules Verne thought people actually could do more important things in the future than they had in the past. It wasn't just tall tales. Verne believed people would go to the moon, and people who believed in Verne did so, and eventually they did. But it got to the point around the end of the last century when people realized that progress wasn't something that was automatic. At first, writers like Verne just sort of took the future for granted, I think, and he's been criticized for this. That's neither here nor there. But at any rate, you got the impression that there's a tremendous conflict in the world between progress and regress. You had the emerging ideas of science and intelligence and regressive ideas of, I guess you could call it psychosocial inertia. That's what intellectual conservatism amounts to. And science fiction became a field of literature that dealt with the whole complex of the problems of change, not just politics, but changes in the sciences, sociology, everything. but it basically took an optimistic view of mankind. It was fundamentally a rationalist brand of literature. The idea was that we've got problems, but the only way we're going to solve them is by using our brains. Now, obviously, this is something that didn't fit in too well with the mainstream. As you probably know very well, around the time of World War I, the mainstream tended to get taken over by this anti-rational philosophy, all this Dadaism and surrealism, and most of all, a concern for the moment. Your slice of life, you understand, isn't just a spatial slice, it's a temporal slice. People who write so-called realistic fiction actually don't have the slightest conception of anything beyond their own time, much less beyond their own space. And this is a age, because of its rapid change, when we have to be thinking about the future in order to survive. We may be going into a new renaissance, or we may be going to hell, but the only thing that's going to decide this is whether we use our brains or not. Now, science fiction has helped prepare people for change in a great way, I think. First, it's communicated the values and attitudes of science, the desirability of knowledge, the importance of understanding how the universe and society works so we can deal with it. Second, it's projected various future problems we may face. Science fiction stories are usually based on the premise of what would happen if this goes on. And it should be obvious that unless you know what future problems are likely to be, you don't have any chance of dealing with them. Well, this was the essential basis of science fiction for, I guess 100 years or so. It wasn't made much attention to by the mainstream. I mean, the mainstream just ignored it. It was sort of considered a sub-literature until the atom bomb fell in 1945. And then science fiction was suddenly noticed. I mean, science fiction had been writing stories about atomic power and atomic war and problems like this for 50 years before, but it wasn't until 1945 that it dawned on the mainstream that science fiction had been talking about something that would be important in the future. Well, when science fiction became noticed by the mainstream, it became sort of self-conscious. It had been in a ghetto for at least 50 years, and it had been subject to all sorts of attacks by the mainstream, just escapist nonsense and subliterate and all like that. And when the mainstream finally noticed it, there were certain critics in science fiction who thought, well, now that we've been noticed by the science fiction, maybe we can become accepted. And the idea of the critics was to make science fiction into literature with a capital L. Now, as you know, literature with a capital L tends to mean something different nowadays than it used to. And the critics in science fiction were sort of torn both ways. And on the one hand, they understood the real values of science fiction, the way science fiction operated. But on the other hand, they realized that the standards of mainstream were concerned entirely with the slice of life in the moment and with the basic idea of anti-rationality. And so there's sort of an ambivalent attitude they developed. And this has been going on now for the past 20 years, but it's only reached a crisis in the last 5 years. During the 1950s, there was a great hope by people like Damon Knight and James Blish and Judith Merrill, who started the Milford Science Fiction Writers Conference, that they could make science fiction into accepted literature. What this amounted to basically was watering down science fiction. There was less emphasis on real ideas about the issues and problems of the future. Instead, you got sort of rehashes of ideas that had already been used and sort of watered down with humdrum characterization and humdrum human conflict. Or else you had, there was this big call for social criticism, because, of course, some mainstream critics think the only purpose of literature is social criticism. So where you got some books that were honest science fiction social criticism, that is based on criticism of the results of trends rather than just on current conditions. You also got a whole bunch of routine stuff, just attacking routine targets. Well, there are stories about the war and racism and the battle of the sexes. I mean, these are important topics, but they aren't exactly science fiction topics because they're things that are going on right now. I mean, you can deal with those in mainstream fiction any day. And you also started to get some philosophical influence from the mainstream. There were writers like Philip K. Dick, who started presenting the subjective idea of reality. You know, reality is all in the imagination. You may turn into a pumpkin at midnight. And while there's still a great deal of honest science fiction being written, it tended to get buried in the dross. But despite all the efforts of the critics to make science fiction accepted literature, it really wasn't accepted anymore in the early 1960s than it had been in the late 1940s. So then you had the deluge, and this was something called the New Wave. Now, there's a lot of, sometimes you may have read something about the New Wave in science fiction reviews in the magazines. I don't really know how familiar this audience is with science fiction. But at any rate, the idea of the New Wave was basically to throw out all the essential elements of science fiction and just write mainstream avant-garde stories with gadgetry thrown in. And the only relation it really had to science fiction was that they used some of the terminology and some of the gadgets. That's all it amounted to. But you had guys like J.G. Ballard in England, who was sort of a successor of Dada in the Surrealist school, and he wrote a number of disaster stories in which the disasters are never explained and the characters never do anything about them or even try to understand them. Since then, he's moved on to something called the condensed novel, which is sort of a surrealistic montage, all sorts of images about what the connection between Marilyn Monroe and quasars is supposed to be. I mean, the guy's really nuts. But at any rate, he and Michael Moorcock, who isn't quite as nuts, just stupid, took over the British science fiction magazine New Worlds and staged a literary revolution, so they called it, and turned it into an avant-garde magazine. So you have a so-called science fiction magazine that's full of all sorts of stupid imitations of Beckett and Kafka and Joyce that have nothing to do with science fiction. And though they claim to be very committed to the problems of this age, they really have nothing to do with these problems of the age because you can't figure out what they're talking about. The only way you can solve a problem is to understand it, and they aren't interested in understanding the problems. All they're interested in is like those existentialists who've been crying in their beer for the last 40 years because God won't tell them what to do. Then there's another school in the New Wave. This is led by Harlan Ellison, who writes something called Dangerous Visions. What Dangerous Visions amounts to is really social protest fiction. It's sort of like what you find in New American Review, only like the British school, they sort of drop a science fiction terminology into it, but it's intensely concerned with the moment. I mean, they have, Harlan Ellison will write stories with such profound messages as, blacks passing for white is bad. Gee, as if this were some real big deal. And aside from that, he takes sort of a Cotton Mather-ish attitude. These constant messages like, you are the monsters, and he expects if he calls people names long enough, they'll improve themselves. I don't know why he expects this to work. When it was called Puritanism 200 years ago, it sure didn't. Then you've got the evidence they like to present that science fiction has been noticed by the mainstream, and the primary evidence so far is a guy named William S. Burroughs. Have any of you heard of him? Well, at any rate, he's even crazier than Ballard and Ellison, but at any rate, what got him involved in the New Wave business was that in 1964 he wrote a book called Nova Express, and he proclaimed that he was really writing science fiction. You know, this is the real science fiction. He didn't even know what a nova was, of course. He thought it was an exploding planet, but that doesn't matter because as far as he's concerned, the universe is nuts anyway. And he's got some real crazy ideas, too. For instance, he thinks the main problem with the world is that there's girls in it. You know, if you killed off all the women, this would solve the world's problems. But at any rate, both the Ballard School and the Allison School think Burroughs is really the in thing. You know, my friend Lester Del Rey was asking Ellison about it about a year ago, and Ellison said, well, it's an experience, man. Yeah, and so what isn't? But at any rate, what you got to understand is that this so-called new wave science fiction meets the mainstream standards of fiction. It's got this whole anti-science outlook, the same sort of thing you get in Louis Mumford. I guess you know Louis Mumford is the guy who thinks that the Middle Ages were paradise and Galileo was the serpent. But they have these craziest ideas, which they express, of course, in movies like Alphaville. That the only thing wrong in the world is science. If we only got rid of science, you know, and went back to this tribal love rock existence or whatever it is, it would solve all our problems and we wouldn't have to worry about anything. Well, I got news for them. You can't go backwards in this universe. Either life goes forward or it goes back. Or as Heinlein says, you can turn a pig into a sausage, but you can't turn a sausage into a pig. We're going to have a future that involves science and technology, whether we like it or not, and we'd better understand science and technology because these are things we're going to have to understand and cope with the problems of the future. And this is exactly what the new wave fiction does not do. It's simply ignorance, anti-rationality, and hysteria. Well, this new wave movement got the support of all the critics because the critics, you know, wanted to be recognized as artists with a capital A, you know, and get all the recognition at meetings of the Modern Language Association and mentions in the Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook and things like that. And it got to be quite a civil war in science fiction for a while. It's died down to a bit because of people like Lester and I strongly opposing the new wave. They've gone undercover to an extent. All the people who were promoting the new wave 3 or 4 years ago are suddenly saying, oh, there isn't any new wave and we aren't leading it. You know, it's sort of like trying to pin a piece of jelly to the wall. But at any rate, there's nevertheless been a great deal of damage done to science fiction, and this is because science fiction has lost touch in general with its basic ideas and attitudes. Now, when science fiction was a ghetto, in a literary ghetto, it developed its own traditions and attitudes. You understand that nobody had ever come up with some grand literary theory for it. But the people who wrote science fiction, the people who read science fiction, understood what it was about. I mean, they were sort of immersed in the traditions of the field. The influence of the critics over the past 20 years and of the new wave in the last few years has broken down this sense of tradition. There's new writers coming into the field who really don't know anything about science fiction. And this is even more true of fans coming into the field. I've been trying to reverse this trend by writing articles and reviews and issuing fanzines that try to give the fans and writers and editors an idea of what science fiction really is and what it should be doing. But the critical establishment is sort of going the other way, or it has sort of an ambivalent attitude. And you get guys like James Blish, who 1 month in a magazine they'll be perfectly sane and give good reviews to a good science fiction book. And yet the next month, this same guy will have his critical judgment completely overwhelmed because somebody's done another imitation of Joyce or Robbe-Grillet. See, Blish happens to be a Joyce expert, and so well, sort of like the case of the children, there have been experiments done on children that show if they're permitted to choose freely among any foods, they'll generally choose the foods that are most nutritious for them almost by instinct, except if you give them sugar, because sugar seems to overwhelm the instinct somehow. And the critics are like this. They'll support science fiction unless you start giving them sugar, and the sugar in this case is imitation mainstream pseudo-experimental writing like imitation Joyce, imitation Robbe-Grillet, imitation Kafka, imitation Beckett, the whole line. And so you've gotten to a situation where there's no real critical standards either imposed on or expected of science fiction these days. And so while the hardcore new wave probably amounts to somewhat a minority of the fiction actually being published, it tends to get most of the critical attention. And there's another influence, too, in that very little really thoughtful science fiction is being written these days. What you get mostly in the middle of the spectrum between honest science fiction and the new wave these days is junk, and there's various kinds of junk. For instance, Robert Silverberg wrote a novel called The Man in the Maze, which basically stole a plot from Sophocles' Philoctetes and transferred it into a science fiction context. And this is supposed to be a new thing. Well, maybe it was new 2,000 years ago with Sophocles, but still trying to jam some old thing like that into a science fiction context doesn't make it into any sense, because of course he's got this conflict with alien intelligences, and the alien intelligences don't have any basis of their own. They're just symbols for the ancient Greek gods, which doesn't make any sense at all. Or else you get novels like Silverberg's The Tower of Glass, which is supposed to be about the problem of developing androids in the future. But since the keystone of the mainstream is now relevance, the problems of the androids differ in no particular whatsoever from the race problem of today, even though new problems, new situations always have new problems of their own. But in this watered-down type of science fiction, all that's done is that they slap the old problem into the new situation. And, you get a lot of junk like this written. But at any rate, the problem is to try to get a strong counter-movement going that'll make people understand what science fiction is, develop critical standards that are appropriate to the real purposes of science fiction. And I'm available for questions afterwards if there's no time now.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce, I understand, has some position papers and other matters which you might be interested in approaching him on, which you'll see him privately during the conference. We're going to take a short break of about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll be beginning right away.